Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Sifu, T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 98, where we're going to be picking up in part 2 as we were looking at these secret societies in the Chinese martial arts. But before we get into that, I'd like to make sure that I extend my best to all those who are still recovering from the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew. It really laid a wallop on a lot of us, and many people have not recovered from it or may not recover and get back to the way of life they had beforehand. So wherever we can, extend a helping hand. Since the last podcast, I had also attended a Dragon Society martial arts symposium on the south side of Charlotte, North Carolina, in a place called Dallas. I wanted to extend my very best to Alex Carrazza, the gentleman who hosted this event, and also to Troy Price, who I got to meet out there as well, who is an incredible teacher and practitioner in jiu-jitsu. It was also great to be able to spend some time with Paul Cody again, who does a lot of work in the Xingyi and the Bakwa, and his inline Bakwa forms are great to watch. And I had also wanted to share one other thing, and it was basically the behind-the-scenes story for me. As most of you all know, this program is designed, it started off almost exclusively in the Chinese martial arts and things like that. And since then, and a lot with the listeners' input, it's taken on some legs and gone to some new places, and I've been really glad that it has. But one of the things that's happened for me is that all of my practice, all the years of my martial arts training, was in a familial system of the Chinese martial arts. So when I get to attend something like this, even though these folks are good people and I've gotten a chance to meet them, when I'm in their domain, so to speak, it's really taken a lot for me to get used to the culture. And it reminds me very much of the podcast where we did is looking at the traditional culture in the Aikido Center as Dr. Tan researched it in Canada. And those, if you're interested, was in episodes number 94 and 95. But I'm sharing this with you because even though, for example, I know a lot about Troy and Alex and Paul, these folks, the Dragon Society is something that I'm not unfamiliar with. It was my first time actually being engaged with the folks, but being in their facilities and looking at, how they're dressed and things like that and everything. But I have to get used to being in a totally different type of environment. So if you, for example, are planning to attend something that's a little different than what you're used to, I would encourage you first, get comfortable being uncomfortable and try not to be on the defensive. I was spending time trying to observe what maybe I should or should not do because I didn't want to insult anyone, especially when I'm a guest in their house. So as I'm working through some of this, I wanted to share that with you so you know that it's not always easy to put yourself in a whole new place, even if you have a lot of background and a lot of confidence in what you do. And speaking of confidence in what you do, that leads me very nicely into my good friend Ian Abernathy. And recently he published a little video, and it wasn't, one of the biggest videos he's done or anything like that, but I thought it was really important because it was a simple video titled Basic Body Shifting Pad Drill. And the reason I wanted to recognize it is that Ian does something that many practitioners do not. And he practices and teaches folks to be awkward. And by that, what I mean is that when you're actually sparring, if you're actually going to take your martial art to a place that is beyond sparring, then you're going to have to practice in a way that makes you uncomfortable, puts your body in positions that you wouldn't be comfortable with. And the creed here in the practical martial arts is that if you have to practice all the time being comfortable, you're never going to make it. In this one video, he demonstrates an exercise where you're throwing a right hand as you're in flight, basically just trying to get the heck out of dodge. Then when you're taking the offensive and you get yourself in motion, and then when you're actually trying to finish and deliver a strike so that you can escape. And I really enjoy that because it brings back that sense of athleticism that you have to have and you have to practice because it's not going to come to you when you need it if you've never done it. So I would encourage you to watch that little video and see how you could take some of your techniques and some of your thoughts and what you try to do and see if you can make it work in a way that it doesn't feel like it's going to work. And then you'll have something. It is sometimes the simplest little exercises like this one being demonstrated that can really help you elevate your martial arts to the next level. And Ian, I know you'll be listening. Thank you for sharing all that you do. And I also wanted to mention that you can support this program by a number of different ways. You can go to kungfupodcast.com/support. And also because of several of the questions that I've gotten here, I set up a page with a lot of the training gear that I currently use for myself and with the students. And it's the sparring gear. If you want to see some of that, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/gear. And I'll put a lot of that stuff right there so you can just see it, look at it. They're my affiliate links that I was recently able to attain, so you can support this program by purchasing your high-quality sparring gear right from the page. Just go to kungfupodcast.com/gear. Now let's move into part 2, where we're looking at the secret societies, organized crime, and Chinese martial arts. In part 1, we covered the marginalization and migration of the Chinese from San Francisco through Chicago and Houston all the way up to New York City. We looked at the role of law enforcement and their recorded evidence of lockups of the martial art weapons that were in the 1877-1878 range. The problems of getting protection for both the good guys and the criminals due to language and cultural barriers. The fact that the New York City Police Department was barely 25 years old when some of the most violent Tong, Triad, and gang battles were forming. Then as we were closing it up, we looked at Tom Lee, who had left from San Francisco to go to New York City with the agenda of helping the Chinese people get reacclimated into a new place. But instead, he becomes the head of the Onlyong Tong organized crime and is the first appointed Chinese person in New York City history in law enforcement. As the abusive marginalization of these Chinese people continued, gangs developed to protect these areas and communities, for example, like in New York City. But later these protective gangs become predatory and started shaking down the local merchants and businessmen for protection. Now, many of these merchants were part of the Tong, so they decided to hire the gangs to protect their organizations. According to the author Abinsky, the members of these gangs were young, sometimes 13 years old, but the gang leaders were 30 years old or so, and they were martial arts masters. And they were taking these newly skilled, newly indoctrinated youth and training them to become a protective force for hire. This physical culture that exists in martial arts, like when we were sparring and things like that, allows gangs to also practice staged recruiting scenarios. They would target a promising young recruit, and they would take a few of the gang members and send them out to put a beat down on this new young recruit, who would be rescued by the gang leader, and then promise them protection and training. It's important to know that some of these gangs were not directly related to the Tong, but often a Tong member would be the central leader and martial arts instructor for all of the gang members. They would be hired to use these skills to protect the gambling houses, prostitution, and drug facilities. For example, the Onlyong Tong Merchant Association was associated with the Ghost Shadow Street Gang. The Hip Sing Tong aligned themselves with the Flying Dragons Gang. There were other instances that there was no separation between the Tong and the gang due to the very tight relationships and the memberships involved. As the Onlyong Tong was gaining ground, as in most things in life, there has to be a counterbalance. You can't have left with too much right. And it doesn't matter if Microsoft kicks it off, Apple's going to want to have a piece of the pie. There's always going to be this interaction between at least one or two contrasting or opposing forces. As the Tongs were developing, Scott Seligman, the author of the book Tong Wars, The Untold Story of Vice, Money, and Murder in New York's Chinatown, says it like this, quote, "The New York Herald reported that the Celestials are delighted over the success of Tom Lee's application and feel sure they will not be molested in their own neighborhood." End quote. He was going on to describe that the Chinese community, which had lacked political power, clearly could not rely on the police or the courts for justice. In Tom Lee, they had a well-connected advocate. But if nature abhors a vacuum, then capitalism just detests monopolies. Soon, rival factions like the Hip Sing emerged to challenge Tom Lee and his Onlyon Tong. The most powerful, the Hip Sing, were connected to a brotherhood founded in San Francisco decades earlier. The Hip Sing Tong cleverly recognized that it could exploit Tom Lee's alliance with the Tammany Hall by aligning themselves with the Tammany Hall enemies. Aha! See? Ancient strategy. Enemy of my enemy is my ally. In the early 1890s, Hip Sing Tong leaders gradually worked their way into the good graces of the anti-Tammany forces, led by, if you can believe it or not, moralistic Methodist minister Charles Parkhurst and a crusading assistant district attorney named Frank Moss. The minister, Parkhurst, was determined to bring moral order to Chinatown and became convinced that the Hip Sing loathed the corruption perpetrated by the Onlyon Tong. Now, we can tell already there had to be some massive hoodwinking, nudge, or, look, you can't see behind the curtain kind of stuff going on. Because the Hip Sing Tong was led by Mok Duk, whom Seligman described as having a reputation for being cunning and brutal. Now, Mok Duk is somebody that you could spend a whole day, maybe even a whole weekend, researching his life and the brutal adventures associated with it. I just looked at enough to go, he was a bad guy. How did he get tied in with Charles Parkhurst, a Methodist minister? And he must have been one slick guy as well as brutal and cunning. In the 30 years after the first Tong flare-up in 1900, which was ignited by the killing of Lung Kim, whose story started in podcast number 97, several more official wars would erupt, along with many other smaller skirmishes along the way. The second flare-up began in 1909, and it was known as the Four Brothers War, and it was named after a clan organization that fought the Onlyongs. The third launched in 1912. Just a few days after, Chinatown celebrated the declaration of Sun Yat-sen's Republic of China with the explosion of 100,000 firecrackers, which also sparked a battle over the control of New York's opium trade. And the fourth had nothing to do with illicit business at all. It was kicked off in 1924 after a large group of renegade Onlyongs joined the Hip Sing. The account of all the Tong Wars are bloody. You will lose track of the rapidly accumulating body count as well as the related jailings and legal proceedings that are associated with them. But while the wars have been long perceived as Chinese-on-Chinese crime, Seligman says, quote, nobody really understands that the Chinese were only half the equation in what was going on, end quote. It wasn't just that the Chinese attempted to exploit partnerships with Tammany Hall on one side and the Parkhurst organization on the other. There was an important political backdrop that also had to be acknowledged in this process. This was the era of rising distrust of Chinese immigrants. As mentioned in Part 1, in 1882, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first and still the only immigration law to have targeted one particular ethnicity. It severely restricted Chinese immigration while making it nearly impossible for those who had already arrived to become U.S. citizens. It also presaged several decades of legal and overt discrimination against ethnic Chinese, which manifested itself on the ground in New York as poor treatment at the hands of the authorities. The Four Brothers Law was sparked partly by a consequence of the Exclusion Act, a lack of Chinese women in America. There were thousands of Chinese men for every Chinese woman in America's Chinatowns. The Four Brothers were also allies to the Hip Sing. Seligman explains it as, quote, at the turn of the century, to the extent there were children in Chinatown, the majority were mixed race. They weren't many Chinese women you could marry, so the Chinese men would marry races of other women, end quote. These massive organized crime battles were occurring inside this cultural community, and the Chinese martial arts were a major part of this community, so much so it could almost go unnoticed. It's kind of like noticing that a fish is in water. There's so much of it you can't even see it. But when something is embedded into a culture, you may actually have to slow yourself down to account for it because it would just go underneath the consciousness. Sometimes it's helpful when an outsider comes in and reports what they see. And the advantage is that when the outsider comes in, they see from their own perspective, which is different from what we see. Or when the outsider tells the story of what they saw and experienced, then you can see it as part of the culture. For example, there are examples of where the descriptions of Chinatown will include a single building, a Chinese restaurant, a doctor, and a martial arts weapons store. And they're all couched as if these separate establishments were inclusive to a very natural description of the backdrop of this town. In fact, the Washington Post had an article where the description of a single business was, quote, first floor medicine, second floor martial arts, third floor dentist, end quote. The connections between these early 20th century organized crime figures and martial arts are not too hard to make. Take the 1995 New York Magazine article called My Life as a Gangster, which I do intend to bring to you in greater detail later. It is where it is the first-person account from a Caucasian man who discusses his life as a Chinese gangster. And it states that there is no Chinese blood in this man, but his training of martial arts and later Kung Fu got him into Chinatown, where he later attended Chinese parties, dated Chinese women, started training Kung Fu in Chinatown, and ate at all the restaurants around there while learning the language. Now, this description is amazingly like some of the descriptions and accounts given by Agent of Action Dr. Tan in Kung Fu Podcast number 94 and 95, Finding a Cultural Identity Through Aikido. Martial arts provided this middle-class Caucasian boy of Irish ancestors an avenue into a culture that he turns these skills into becoming a well-established, professional, organized crime member. From the 1920s through the 1960s, the Tong and Triad Wars provide creative material, so much so that it's picked up by Hollywood, playing a significant role in the plots of movies like The Cameraman from 1928. Interestingly enough, I watched a 5-minute clip of this 1928 silent film, and you will see the long dragon dances and what appears to be some folks doing martial arts in the street parade. And then once the fighting breaks out, it's gun to gun, blade to blade, and hand-to-hand combat scenes, including one where one blade-carrying Tong member attacks a different Tong member who is unarmed, and they go through a whole fight scene right there. So I'm going to bring part 2 of Secret Societies in Chinese Martial Arts to a close. We've just covered all the way up to about 1928, where we're looking at the cinematic representation of some of these gangs, Chinese martial arts, lion dances, and we're going to be going from here into the 1930s and 1950s. We're going to have names like Lao Bon, Bruce Lee, interactions against Choli Foot, Praying Mantis. We're going to have quite a few things coming up in part 3, which is almost recorded. I'm still editing it. But one of the things with this program at Kung Fu Podcast that I've been asked to do by you all, some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world, is try to get it back to at least every 2 weeks as far as a release. And that's my goal. Now, that's going to mean that sometimes the publication is going to be 20 to 40 minutes long. Sometimes it may be longer. All depends upon the depth of research I have to do in order to put together a good program, because one thing as martial artists we don't do is we don't slop. You might as well put something out that's small and well-researched and well-practiced as compared to just rushing through your form and making it look like you just did it, as compared to really just isolate what you got, do your best, and go with it. Well, that's how I'm going to approach Kung Fu Podcast. I appreciate you all a lot and reaching out from the different places around this world, literally sending me emails and other correspondence to let me know what you think about the program. Please keep that up. It inspires me, it motivates me, and I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you so much for joining me as we explored the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. This is Sifu T.W. Smith, and I want you to be looking for part 3 of Secret Societies in Chinese Martial Arts to be ready for you next week. Take care, get in your practice, and keep moving. Talk to you soon.